Hey, how's it going everyone? This is the Anime Man. So an interesting article was sent to me by you lovely folks over on Twitter today regarding the internationally acclaimed Studio Ghibli. Studio Ghibli, for those of you who don't know, are an anime production company who have gone on to create some timeless and internationally acclaimed anime film, whose list of films is so large and great that it warrants a second video just to bask in its everlasting glory and fame. But it seems a certain individual in the anime industry today has been throwing a little bit of shade at Studio Ghibli. Yo, wait, whoa, jeez, fold the fuck up. I can see the comments already. What the fuck? Modern Ghibli films are amazing. Who's the douchebag that's throwing shade at my Ghibli senpai? Prepare the torch and pitchforks. Well, surprisingly, the shade is actually being thrown by this man right here by the name of Kihara Hirot, who, believe it or not, is actually a former Studio Ghibli staff member. Studio Ghibli exposed, bitch! So firstly, to cover some background information on this fabulous head individual, Kihara Hirot was a staff member for Studio Ghibli back in the 80s, who after leaving Ghibli went on to make a name for himself in the horror film industry by giving his helping creative hand on pants-shittingly scary films like The Grudge. This man went from big hairy fluffy hairball monster to actually scary monster.
That escalated quickly.
However, in a recent interview, he expressed his thoughts on modern Studio Ghibli films, and not only calling them outright boring, but also giving us an inside look into Studio Ghibli as a company, and all the points are actually quite interesting. I left the link to the full interview that Kihara did in the description below, so I definitely recommend you go check it out, but if you can't be bothered, then let me highlight some interesting points from that interview for you. One of the biggest criticisms that he expressed was the overwhelming responsibilities and weight on the shoulders of directors Miyazaki and Takahata Isao. Now these guys are pretty much responsible for all of the Studio Ghibli films that you have come to know and love, but he mentioned them by saying, quote, "Each film is Miyazaki, then Takahata, then Miyazaki, then Takahata, instead of, for example, Disney and Pixar style, where they get everyone to throw in ideas. Now they dump all responsibility on the director's shoulders. They're overworked. They don't have enough time to come up with new ideas or mature the ones they have." He also went on to say, quote, "During the 3 films that I worked on, I was Miyazaki's confidant in terms of ideas and concepts. From that experience, I noticed the problem was that Miyazaki likes to put everything of himself and everything that he had into one film. But when you've done that work, what's left?" And finally, following the question of how Kihara sees the actual company progressing from here on out, he explains by saying, quote, "There's a sense that everyone is replaceable, even Miyazaki. Rather than hire creatives with great ideas, they hire people who will please the producers. They want followers, not leaders. That's why the work is reducing in quality." He also went on to explain the possible reasons behind the international success of Studio Ghibli, as well as behind the scenes of the secretive and mysterious work environments behind Studio Ghibli and their creation process. But again, I recommend you go check out the full interview because it's actually really interesting. Firstly, let's clear up this point before moving on because it's clearly the elephant in the room. There is a shitload of bias here. It really makes sense that Kihara is sucking the dicks of the early Studio Ghibli films that he actually had a creative hand in, and yawning at the modern Studio Ghibli films that he had absolutely no part in. And I think Kihara is fully aware of that when answering these questions, and thus he's able to answer them without holding anything back and really express what he thinks deep down. I mean, he left the company almost 20 years ago. I doubt Miyazaki is gonna come for his ass anytime soon after Studio Ghibli had made an international name for themselves. For me though, there are really 2 different thoughts that crossed my mind after I read this article for the first time. On a surface level, I found myself arguing against some of Kihara's statements. For one thing, Princess Mononoke is actually my favorite Studio Ghibli film, and I think one of the best created Studio Ghibli films of all time. Not to mention there are so many Studio Ghibli films way after the first 3 that I think are still really good quality films. Not just in a visual aspect, but also in a storytelling and execution aspect. I mean, if the fact that Spirited Away got an Academy Award for Studio Ghibli doesn't spell it out clearly enough for you, then I don't know how else to convey Studio Ghibli's obvious international success. But another thought that crossed my mind below the surface level found myself actually agreeing with some of Kihara's statements. Concerning the quote about Miyazaki loving to throw everything about himself and what he is about, both historically and psychologically, into his films, I do agree that after a while, there will be some kind of limit. I think at this point, it's safe to say that Miyazaki has really thrown everything, like every single corner of himself, into his films. I do understand that he's like an old dude and he's lived so many more years than all of us combined, but seriously, there's still a limit. It's just one person. Like, there is a limit to how much about one person you can convey in film. And the question is, what's going to happen to Studio Ghibli films once everything about Miyazaki has run out and there is really nothing new about himself that he can throw into the next Studio Ghibli film? Because it can't just be something petty either. It can't just be like, oh, I like cheese, therefore I'm going to make a Studio Ghibli film about cheese. As you know, Miyazaki always takes huge pride in his works and has always said that if the next Studio Ghibli film drops, then it's really the end of Studio Ghibli and there's no recovering from it. Hence the reason why he's probably retired from Studio Ghibli like, what, 7 times and is still somehow working for them? Judging by Miyazaki's independent and, dare I say, dictatorship-like style of writing and filmmaking, once he does reach that limit, it's going to inevitably result in a drop of quality in Studio Ghibli films. So, as Kihara mentions, why not gather a bunch of ideas from Studio Ghibli staff members and make a brainstorming idea and combine it into one idea? Well, to me, it seems like it's because Miyazaki just doesn't trust these plebeian ideas, or that he's not really a big fan of creating a disorganized jumble of ideas and forcefully trying to create it into an organized idea. But if that is the case, then why not hire some highly acclaimed and professional writers and directors and collaborate with Studio Ghibli to make a completely new kind of film with new and fresh ideas? Because Miyazaki isn't the only anime film director out there. There are so many large and highly acclaimed names in the anime film world, so why not get a helping hand from them? I'm sure they'd love to collaborate with the greats of Studio Ghibli. How cool would it be to see a Studio Ghibli film directed by both Miyazaki Hayao and Shinkai Makoto, or a Studio Ghibli film written by Miyazaki Hayao and Hosoda Mamoru? Better yet, why not bring the greats of directors like Kon Satoshi and really make a rather dark and twisted Studio Ghibli film more fit for the adult audience? Because I know I, along with many other anime film fans, will agree that that is something that we will be totally down for. But then again, I can't exactly agree with everything Kihara says in this interview, especially the quote concerning the comparison between Studio Ghibli and the likes of Pixar and Disney. Yes, with the way that Disney and Pixar films are created, it is a lot easier to brainstorm a bunch of ideas and gags and push them in seamlessly into a already structured set of stories and characters. This is kind of a weird and twisted way to put it, but as long as the audience enjoys it, it's funny, it's entertaining, it's eye-catching, then that's a success for Disney and Pixar. But I think that's really where there is a clear line between Disney and Pixar and Studio Ghibli, in that Studio Ghibli's works are, how should I say, a lot more personal. The idea of gathering a whole bunch of ideas, brainstorming all together, and then putting it into a story like Disney and Pixar does works well for films that Disney and Pixar make. And that's why Disney and Pixar are successful on their own, because they have really mastered that idea of brainstorming ideas, pushing it into a story, making some comedy, and making the audience laugh and entertain. But when a film focuses more on things like world building and psychological development and a rather unique way of storytelling, like in a lot of Studio Ghibli films, there needs to be some sort of leader or head person that really knows how to steer this kind of story in the right direction with the right types of themes, without going off the rails with a brainstorm gag every 2 seconds. And in the case of Studio Ghibli, that very leader is Miyazaki Hayao. And that's probably why Miyazaki Hayao has decided to work independently when creating his films, because he's fully aware about how these films should be created. By the way, just to clear things up, I am not slandering or throwing shade at Disney and Pixar films. I fucking love Disney and Pixar films. I'm just showing you the big differences between how Disney and Pixar make their films versus how Studio Ghibli make their films. None is the correct way and none is the wrong way. They're both the correct way, they're just different ways, and they work for each studio. But in the end, how you feel about the quality of a film is completely biased and extremely subjective. While Kihara will say that Kiki's Delivery Service was the best Studio Ghibli film ever made and nothing in the future that Studio Ghibli will make will ever top that, I'm sure there are many people watching this video right now who would love to disagree with him. Bottom line is that the differences in storytelling, writing, creating a film, directing a film, and the responsibilities that follow within that, and the value of quality between certain pieces of entertainment greatly differ from person to person. As a fan of Studio Ghibli right from their roots and beginnings, I would personally love to see Studio Ghibli continue on into the next decade and really make some great films. If I were to give just one piece of advice to Studio Ghibli, that would be, please collaborate with Satoshi Kon and make a Studio Ghibli version of Perfect Blue. I will fucking jizz to that shit. Guys, let me know in the comments below what you think about all this. Do you agree with Kihara in thinking that modern Studio Ghibli films are in fact boring? Or do you think that modern Ghibli films are just as good as how they originally were? Also, what's your favorite Studio Ghibli film ever made, and what would your piece of advice be to Studio Ghibli and the likes of Miyazaki Hayao in helping Studio Ghibli to maintain its quality, maintain its filmmaking, and to make great films? Again, guys, if there's any piece of anime news or any kind of article or interesting piece of information that you find online that you'd like me to talk about in these kinds of anime rants, then the best place to do it is over on Twitter. So make sure to follow me on Twitter, link me those articles, and I might make a video about it like this one. Anyways,